This week I had the opportunity to look at the militarization unit in our course, and I really was attracted to diving deeper into the relocation of the Quebec Inuit after watching the NFB film over the relocation of Quebec Inuits. My name is Rebecca Jahor, and I'll be taking you further onto this journey of research with me, looking over the militarization and how that affected Quebec Inuits in the area. Beginning with the claiming of the high Arctic islands, we look at the early 1900s when Canada decided it was finally time for them to take a stand on owning rights and sovereignty to the high Arctic islands. And so we look at Joseph Elzer Bernier, who was taking lead, a Quebecois sea captain, and trying to channel out more journeys and such in the high Arctic waters to have more hold onto the land and space up there. He marked much of the land as Canadian soil, and then he also ran into the Greenlandic Inuit, which were crossing to Ellesmere Island to hunt. This group has done such for centuries at a time. Like, we're looking at a group that's had vigorous and intense connections to this soil and this land. Another forgotten Indigenous group in the militarization of the high Arctic islands. Canada decided we had to take the next step on setting rights down onto claiming this soil as Canadian land. And so we then moved on to the 1920s. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police started establishing stations in Dundas Harbour, on Devon Island, Craber Harbour, Batch Peninsula, and Ellesmere Island as well. The group's duties were basically just to hold the land as their own and watch for other groups that were quote-unquote trespassing in the areas. So we often saw these military or RCMP groups getting into confrontations with the Indigenous groups coming from Greenland that were already existing in the area. The Great Depression brought on a completely different push for Arctic control, because with money depleting, these military sources, RCMP sources, were going downhill. And so Canada was looking for the next new, cheapest way to put their claim on the Arctic. Now, beginning with the relocations, this new idea to set down claim in the high Arctic, we looked at in 1953, where 7 families from Inukjuak were placed on a northbound ship. These individuals weren't given tons of chance to actually have the opportunity to know where they were going, what life would be like, but just were given empty promises onto this better world up there. At the same time, the Hudson Bay Company was given control of Dundas Harbour and was given an opportunity to operate as a trading post, making deals with the Indigenous and Inuit people up there and kind of taking advantage of the groups that were living off the more harsh climate up in the Arctic. Again, in 1934, 52 people from Baffin Island were moved up to Dundas Harbour, and they experienced insane living conditions. They were tricked, and it was about 7 families that experienced for a long time great hardship. Because of the lack of resources up there and even opportunities to fuel the trading post, eventually Hudson Bay was forced to close the trading post, which resulted in these people that have been relocated there losing their way of life, because they had to rely off the government and the military to sustain any life being in basically an ice desert up there. And so it was completely insane how they then relocated some of these Indigenous Inuit people to higher up in the Arctic to try and continue their claim, and at the same time returned a few of them back to Baffin Island. Then struck the Cold War. The Cold War brought on immense pressure for Canadians to get staples and ownership up in the Arctic to avoid collision with Russia coming overhead, but also to avoid Russia from stating their claim to the high Arctic. Militarization in the Arctic just continued. The United States was looking for an opportunity to set in what they called distant early warning radars to alarm them if Russia was to come overhead. Meanwhile, in northern Quebec, we saw rumors that the Inuit people were having hard times living off the land continuously. and that food was becoming very scarce. This was kind of more pressure from the government and assimilation with relationships between the Inuit people and the government that was taking away the Inuits' way of life. That means they were becoming more reliant off trading posts. Their pelts and stuff, the government was underpaying them, forcing them to become more reliant, and they were starting what they were calling the Indian problem, referring to as the Indian problem, quote unquote, in northern Quebec. So the government came out with their solution. In 1953, they pushed 7 families from Injuak they were put on a northbound ship headed up into the icy, cold, ice desert. 7 families, they were separated. Family ties were not respected in the slightest. And the vessel then also collected 3 other families from Pond Inlet on northern Banffin Island, who were supposed to help the Southerners adapt, meaning that these people were supposed to be more turned to Arctic ways of life, and therefore were supposed to give their skills to the others that were coming, obviously, from an area in northern Quebec that is not similar at all to the harsh climate they were about to witness. After days aboard the ship, 2 almost inhabitable places were selected for these individuals to stop: Resolute Bay and Grizz Ford. As you can see in the map on the up right-hand side, these locations were insanely, compared to the size of Canada, insanely above and northern from where these individuals were previously living. As stated earlier, this included 7 families and 3 were later added. The families were separated, this meaning that brothers, sisters, cousins, children were separated from their families as they selected who would leave the boat off in different locations. These individuals were promised a better and brighter future, but as they realized when they were just along with some canvas tents along the boat, they were going to have a much harder existence up in these new northern Arctic ways of life. And they were also told if they did not enjoy it, they could return home as soon as possible. There was also a military base up here, and they were expecting that they would work in cohorts with the military base like they had previously done with the Hudson Bay Company, and however, when they made it up there, they were told that they could not have any contact with the military base, and they would more act as a police situation for the new Inuit group in the Arctic. Continuing on with the governmental purpose of the relocation, we saw examples earlier I mentioned on how they were trying to get claim over the more Arctic land to influence the Cold War and Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic. However, there was a whole other direction in this, and that is the assimilation of Indigenous and Inuit people in Canada. They were taking this group up here as almost test dummies to show that if anyone was bold enough to live this way of life, it would be these people. And they also same time saw them as expendable, and saying that if they're potentially going to lose their lives, these were people they saw as pricely costful individuals to the Canadian society and not beneficial in the slightest. It is completely disgraceful to think about this as a part of Canadian history. And watching the documentary, we saw many opportunities where the government did not take credit for the horrible ways of life they put these people through as opportunistic test dummies for this situation, for a governmental claim, for a land claim, the same land they had stolen in previous years. Continuing on, we now look at the lies of the relocation. These individuals were not told straight up what the new life would take them. They were promised that this new world would provide brand new food security, more reliance off themselves and without the government, and opportunities to also work in cahoots with the military base and the Hudson Bay Company like they have before, but in a more productive environment. They were also told that if they did not like it, they could return when they wanted, and after the agent came and journeyed them and realized that they were not enjoying it, he then replied that they were accepting of this new way of life up here and it was going very well, but also at the same time that he told the people they could now return in 2 years if they wanted to, pushing the deadline back and back and back and back. They also had no food access up here. There was absolutely no animals to rely off except for seals and caribou. They were told they could only kill one caribou a year for the community at one general hunting period of time, and you're looking at large families here. Meanwhile, the military could hunt and take advantage of any resources they saw fit in this area. These individuals had to live off the garbage of the military and were treated like vermin when they were found rattling through the trash trying to find a little bit of scraps to eat from the base. Watching the film earlier in the year, I felt remarkable when they saw the kind of ice glaciers that were just these individuals were put to live off. The individuals couldn't even set up their classic, more traditional ways of living. They were forced to live in canvas tents because it was just too cold to move snow to build proper housing. And as we could see in earlier images in my presentation, it just, like, on the left side here, they were building more impromptu homes to try and stay warm during these harsh winters. Continuing on with health issues, we saw lives being cut short. People were having heart attacks from the immense amount of stress. People were losing children. People were dealing with not having access to any type of first aid except for natural remedies that off land that they didn't even have holistic memories or ties to. This is incredibly insane that the government sent these people up here effectively as human flagpoles to basically die and perish. Meanwhile, they could achieve claim over the high Arctic. These people were used as pawns in a game of Risk. The return, ? As we've seen with lots of other settlements in Canada's history today with Indigenous people, it's just insane to me the lack of responsibility the Canadian government is putting into this, especially looking at this module of militarization where these individuals, we've taken the federal army, the federal government, and putting them in this aggressive force with the founders of our lands. And so looking at the return of this situation, we see in 1996, $10 million was paid out to the surviving Arctic exiles, which is their almost nickname term, and their descendants. In 2010, the government finally issued an official apology, and Akwesasne and Kwasinick remain Canada's two northernmost inhabited towns today. The Nunavut Lands Claim Agreement was signed in 1993, and in spite of those lands being the two northernmost inhabited towns, these individuals actually living in these zones didn't actually provide that much help at all to the Cold War or Canada's Arctic claims. It was actually the Nunavut Lands Claim Agreement that formatted Canada's military standing in, and even land claim standing in the high Arctic today. We also see that the legitimate state authority in the high Arctic was gifted by the Nunavut Land Claim Agreement being signed. Many of these individuals, thankfully, eventually had the opportunity to return home. However, some of them did find a new way of living up in these northern towns, and still their families remain today, as the young boy in the photo, who was one of the original individuals shipped up to these northern locations, still resides there today with a much larger family. It is an insane story to look at, and I think this example really of learning and militarization in Canada really settled with me and struck something in my heart when I was watching the documentary that led me to going on this mission of further examining and building opinions around really one of the examples of how we used Indigenous people for a military pressure to gain what we see on the map today. And I think that is an insanely absurd way to do it. Thank you very much for your time. I had a very, very wonderful time researching this project, and I hope you enjoy it as well.